All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, March 1st, 2022. Thanks for tuning into the stream here today. We're going to jump right in. I see we've already got probably at least a half dozen or so questions to get to here on today's stream, so we'll just dive right in. As always, if you've got questions for me, YouTube chat, Office Hours channel in Slack, fire away. We'll answer questions in roughly chronological order here. Let's get right into it because I see, I think we're going to have a busy stream here today. I see there's already been a lot of questions asked. So let's go ahead here. We're going to start. We're going to back up a little bit. We're going to tackle this question from Card Killer. This came in yesterday afternoon. Card Killer said, what settings do I use to make sure I place first in all contests, which is a good joke. The answer to that is obviously the default sliders, which are a guaranteed first on every slate. But there is a kind of a question, a real question underneath here that says, how much do you recommend adjusting the settings, correlation, fade, sim variance, when you have contests that are slightly different in their entry levels and contestants? Do we know roughly where the point of diminishing returns is? Example, 25 max. Best to stick with 20 max and the entrance is the semantical. Contest with 53,000 entrants, easier to stick with 10K to 50 or over 50. There's a substantial difference between a 250K entry contest and a 53K. Just trying to look at how much adjusting the slider impacts it or not. I mean, the short answer to this is that there's not going to be a wrong answer here, really. Like something that you're going to build profoundly bad lineups. I mean, I guess with the exception of like building cash lineups or something like that, or veering, extremely far off what the recommended sliders are. I don't think like 10-10-10 is a set of sliders that I would really use for any contest, really, except for just to see what they look like. And even then, you're probably not going to play terrible lineups. Actually, you're probably just going to play some pretty extremely leveraged lineups. I'll kind of answer these one by one here. So for the 25 max, I think the 20 max sliders are perfectly fine. The difference between 5 additional lineups per person is not going to end up with a spectacularly difference in optimal strategy. I think that's perfectly fine. If you're playing a contest with 53,000 entrants, I would probably use the over 50K sliders. That is what is kind of said there. But if you wanted to, for example, look at the 10 to 50K sliders and see what they look like, and wanted to ultimately end up playing a set of lineups that maybe had a little bit of a lower variance, a little bit lower importance on correlation here, I think that's perfectly fine. As you get familiar with these sliders too, you can handle this a little bit ad hoc, like depending on the contest. One thing I like to look at is the payout structure. If you're playing a really top heavy contest, right? Like the clutch shot tonight on FanDuel, $9, it's 100K to first, 25K to second, right? All the equity is in first place essentially in that contest. I would recommend probably playing pretty aggressively there, right? Probably not justified in bringing anything down, right? But if you were playing a relatively flat contest, the mini max is a good example, or sometimes the and one, some of these lower stakes contests where you can have a lot of entrants, right? Or the piggy bank shot is actually a good example, right? That's a contest where you are playing against an enormous amount of entries, but it's only like 5% to first. I think the top 10 positions only get about like 10% of the total equity in that contest at all. You could be justified in bringing things down a little bit. Either way, the short answer here is that the defaults, if you follow them and stay relatively close to them, they are going to put you in a very good spot, right? They are optimized for particular contests of sizes and entry limits. That said, if you have a reason to do it, I would say in general, you are probably not going to ruin your lineups or even really have a meaningful impact on your expected value of your lineups. Adjusting any slider plus or minus, I would say even 2 to 3 ticks on any of these sliders, right? If you were building for a 150 max of this particular contest and you told me that you built with these sliders instead for one reason or another, I would imagine that your lineups were perfectly sufficient and probably still profitable. There's not a significant difference in the overall what kind of lineups you're going to get out by changing the optimization here, which is also why in general, when people ask, I'm playing a bunch of different contests, should I build everything together? My general answer for that is most often yes, because I think it simplifies the lineup building process, makes it easier to manage exposures and late swap and things like that. And you sacrifice very little by making any adjustments at all. With all that said, I think the last note, and I guess just something interesting to note, especially in football season, I think maybe this is a little less practical during NBA season, but in football, you do have really big contests. This stops at 50K, and it essentially implies that there's not really a meaningful change in optimal strategy after a contest is over the 50K entrance. There are obviously contests that have a lot more entrants than that. If you were playing a 250K top heavy contest, like a milli maker or something like that, right? A typical milli maker. And you wanted to crank this up, right? You can kind of follow the trend, right? So at 1,000 to 10,000, we're here, 147. Then we jump to 159. Then we jump to 2,510. Right? If you were playing a 250,000 person contest or something like that, I would not talk you out of cranking them up a little bit higher or something like that, right? To manifest a little bit of an additional edge there. But again, the short answer here is I would not sweat about this too much. Pick sliders that are close, that represent the contest you're playing. If you are in between, pick sliders that are in between or choose one or the other. If you're playing a bunch of contests, pick a set of sliders that matches the contest you are financially most invested into, or pick the sliders that are kind of the midpoint of all the contests, or pick the contest you most want to win in that pool, and you're going to be fine. So as much as I can stress, really don't stress too much about the sliders. That's kind of our goal here. So, and a good way to do that, actually, too, last point, then we'll move on. A good way to do that is to just play with the sliders and learn more about what they do, especially at the extremes, right? See what impact your sliders have with an ownership fade at 0 and 10, and same thing with the sim variance at 0 and 10. And I think once you get an idea of what the kind of full spectrum of, just with test builds, right? You don't need to enter these lineups. Once you get an idea of what the full spectrum of the sliders actually kind of look like, I think it becomes a little bit more clearer that the difference between ownership fade of 4, 5, and 6 is something, right? They're not the same level, but it's small, and you'll kind of see how the bigger value adds in your process are going to be step 1 and step 3. So anyway, cool. Let's keep it going. I wanted to hit this question. Good one here from Jack, and welcome, Jack. First of all. I think I remember seeing you mention that you are new to SaberSim, so welcome. Jack said, during the office hour show, Jordan was going over GPP lines and was discussing total ownership tally of the line. Example 114, 136, 95. Does anyone know the optimal amount to look for? Wanted to talk about this. So I actually think it's a bit of a common misconception, or maybe some bad common wisdom, that an ownership sum is really anything to look at all. Like it, I would push back on the idea that an ownership sum cap, when you're using SaberSim, is really even worth looking at all. The main reason why is it doesn't take into account any context whatsoever. It ignores the individual context of the slate, right? There are slates where you may have a 11x projected player on average that is going to be 60% owned, and it is by far optimal in that particular situation to roster that player at probably 100% in your lineups, even though that's going to dramatically push up the ownership sum of all your lineups. There are slates where there is going to be no value, right? And your optimal ownership sum is probably going to be a lot lower to try to kind of find an edge through ownership. It depends on the context of the slate size, how big the slate is, not only in that ownership ends up being more depressed on larger slates, but also in the fact that because there's just purely so many players in the pool that you can almost virtually ignore it. Whereas in smaller slates, you need to pay attention. It also depends on the stakes and the size of the contest, right? So ownership sum caps ignore any of that. And if anyone's telling you that you should have an ownership, total lineup ownership of a certain amount, I probably wouldn't recommend following that. What instead I would do is I would run your test build, right? So one thing that's nice about running a test build, again, is that it is going to contextualize the slate in terms of the contest you are playing, the individual projections and ownerships and salaries for that particular slate, the site, the slate size, right? It's going to put everything into context and then look and see about what kind of ownership sums you are getting, right? And what SaberScore is telling us here, for example, with, these two lineups, these first two lineups, is that for this lineup 1 with an ownership sum of 139 and this lineup 2 with an ownership sum of 111%, these lineups are actually approximately equal in their expected value, right? You can kind of see the discrepancy in projected score here as well, right? SaberScore is saying that these lineups virtually have the same amount of profitability if we were to play this slate out 10,000 times. This lineup may finish in the top 5% a little more often. This lineup maybe will finish in the top 0.1% a little more often, but they have about the same profitability. And there's kind of a spectrum. You can go through and just even look at your first 20 lineups and you can kind of get an idea of what the ownership sum makes sense to be for that particular slate, right? I mean, you can see it's about, I would say for this slate with where everything's set right now, it seems like for this particular kind of sized contest, anywhere from like a 95% to 135% or so makes that kind of window of ownership sums. But again, that is really only true for this particular slate and for this particular contest. So one thing that you can do if you are interested in kind of going a little further here is you can compare that to what the cash lineups look like, right? So the cash lineups are going to be the best overall, highest projected lineups you can build. And one thing that I like to do is build a cash pool and just take a look and see what the ownership sums of these lineups are. And then you can kind of see how much projected points am I sacrificing to lower my ownership, right? Because these will likely have a higher ownership sum than the contest we just built lineups for. So, and they do. So, I mean, we can even actually sort by ownership here. So you can see the highest overall owned cash lineups that you can build, the highest projected lineups you can build are anywhere from 168 to 178 too. So the reason why this is important is that saying that around 120% combined ownership for tonight's slate for a 20 max still actually doesn't really tell you much of the story. You kind of need to know what the baseline highest average projected lineup you can build is, right? And then that kind of puts this into better context. That it makes sense to drop your ownership percentage by about 50% to build successful 20 max contests on tonight's slate, 20 max lineups on tonight's slate. So anyway, short answer, again, don't overvalue ownership sum. So, and then let's go ahead and talk about this other question here. This is also from Jack. And he said, can you go over the leverage column and what exactly to look for? Yeah, let's go back to our actual build here first. And take a look here. Give this a second to load back up. Cool. Okay, so the leverage column is your exposure, your percentage of lineups in your pool that roster that player minus the projected ownership. It is essentially the percentage of lineups more or less that your portfolio of lineups has versus the field. In this case, we have 57.7% more Luka than the field is expected to, right? This is a projection I guess actually it is a projection, right? You could calculate your actual leverage you had over the field once the slate locks and you know what Luka's actual ownership is, right? The main thing here, I guess, or the things to look for is, you would really want to make sure that if you sort by positive leverage or by negative leverage, the names that pop up are representative of the way that you want to tackle the slate, right? In other words, the highest leverage players in your pool, the players that show up at the top of the leverage column sorted this way, are your biggest stands. They are your biggest investments into this slate. So you would want to make sure that they are directionally correct, right? That Luka is the play on the slate with which you are the most confident. And also they are in order of magnitude correct, right? So we are essentially twice as confident about Luka and Daniel Gafford in this particular set of 20 than our third highest exposed player, right? So if that wasn't the case, right? Let's say we're not, let's say that first of all, let's do two examples here. Let's say one, that Daniel Gafford simply just isn't one of our most confident plays on the slate, right? Let's lower his exposure to match his ownership, right? Which is going to bring down his leverage to somewhere close to zero, right? Now he's down somewhere, well, somewhere around here, right? Probably actually slightly negative, right? We're about matching the field. And for Luka, let's say we like Luka, but we're not comfortable making the stand that we are twice as confident about Luka than any other play on the slate, right? So let's go ahead and drop this down here to 70%, right? And now we can say, yes, Luka is still the play with which we have the most confidence for this particular slate, but we are about as confident as we are with some of these other players here. And you can see when you adjust exposures, it has a ripple effect through the other parts of your lineup. So then, there's kind of an iterative game of like, are the players that now bounced up here the next best players you want to play? And you can do this from the negative side too, right? Are you comfortable with your biggest stands on the slate basically fading this Boston and Atlanta game, right? Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. Maybe you say, I'm not entirely comfortable with a full fade of Trae Young, right? You don't want that to be your most significant negative leverage stand on the slate. The builder still wants to be under on Trae Young, but maybe you want 10%, right? So now Trae Young is not one of your most negative leverage plays on the slate. The main thing I see trips people up with leverage is I know other tools out there will instead describe leverage as like it will be a strategic statement, right? So if you see that there is positive leverage on a player, I know like Osimo has stuff like this and Roto Grinders and other tools, right? They'll say this player has positive leverage. And what they're saying basically is that player's ownership is lower than the percent chance that player shows up in the winning lineup. So it makes sense to roster more of that player. That is interesting analysis. There are ways to do that kind of thinking in SaberSim as well. But that is not what this leverage column is necessarily in just a typical build, right? It is descriptive of your lineups. It is not suggestive of the optimal strategy on the slate, I guess. Like I would never run a build and say, oh, my highest leverage play on the slate is Luka, so I'm just going to lock Luka in, right? That you can do that if you want more leverage on Luka, but that is not what the leverage column is saying by default. It is not saying get more exposure to this guy. It is saying you have more exposure to this guy. So, anyway, looks like Jackson YouTube chat. He said, you rock nailed both questions. Awesome. Good. And let me know if you have any more, especially as you're kind of getting familiar. Happy to help. So let's keep it going for now. Question from K Polo. He said, under the entries tab during late swap, if I hit update projections button, will it give me the latest projections when I press late swap button? Normally I go all the way back out to the homepage to make sure projections update. Yeah, it will. So let's go ahead, get some entries in here. This thing will also spin on its own virtually anytime you do anything in here, right? We always want to make sure you have the most up-to-date projections. So if you come in here and you're ready to late swap, I don't have any lineups in. So, and click this, it will update with the most recent projections. That's what I do, right? Because it's a bit tedious to go back to step one and come back here. That's actually why this is here. So, yep, you should be good to go there. One exception would be if you have custom projections on step one, we will never overwrite custom projections ever. So if you have custom projections that maybe you need to go update or clear out or whatever, you need to go back to step one to do that. But and then another Jack here. Let's answer this question here. And he said, in step one, FanDuel NBA, is there value in adjusting player projections and exposures to the same player, or is there more value in doing one change, projection or exposure in step one, and then changing the other projection or exposure in step three? Thanks, Jordan. I probably wouldn't say that there's a significant difference here. I In general, it is our philosophy that if you know how you want to approach a particular player, maybe after a test build or your own research, it is better giving us that information in step 1, because then we will build you a pool that is more representative in step 3, right? So if you know, for example, I mean, I guess it kind of depends on how you want to approach it. If you know you want to about be even with the field on Luka, right? You might as well just put that in here so that we know that, and then build you a pool of lineups that has that in step 3. In terms of, is it better to use projections or exposures together or split them up? Again, I think it depends a little bit on what truly you just want to do, right? I think there's kind of an intuitive difference too for different people of what makes more sense to you in terms of whether you want to work with exposures. I know I have talked with people that would say that they think about things from exposures, and this is kind of how I am, where I would say I want to be even with the field on Luka, just for example, right? And others may say this projection kind of seems high for Luka to me, and they want to bring their projection down. The practical impact of those two things at the end with your lineups are going to be kind of the same. You're going to have less Luka in your lineups. I mean, when I personally, like, my use with SaberSim is I typically do more projection edits in step 1 and more exposure edits in step 3. I don't do too much projection updating regardless, but that's kind of how I've always done it. But again, I mean, we give you the ability to edit these things in both steps of the process for a reason. I don't think there is a material difference between doing them in one spot versus the other. So again, I mean, if you have an understanding of how you want to tackle the slate already, tell us in step 1. Step 3 in general should be thought of as, mostly fine tuning and quality control, right? Especially if you're making a lot of adjustments in step 3 and you're finding that you're playing a ton of your lineups that are at the very bottom of your Saber scores or projected scores, or even seeing the message that you need to build more lineups, right? That probably means you'd be better off going back to step 1 and making adjustments there. But yeah. So good question. And I see some questions coming in the YouTube chat. I assure you, we will get to them, but I'm going to hit the questions that came in the Office Hours channel in Slack first. We've got a triple threat here from GEN. Looks like 3 questions here. So we'll hit these real quick in order. First one. Question, sliders, FanDuel NBA. The 11 to 100. I went with the default sliders, but didn't come close to the top 12. My default sliders for the contest, which was 102, which seemed off, but I went with it anyway. No, so 11 to the small field stuff, right? You don't need to take a ton of shots, right, in your optimal strategy to be successful, right? So it's probably a single entry, right? So 112 tonight probably was 102, right? To beat out 99 other opponents, we don't need to be super aggressive with our ownership fade, our sim variance, our correlation, right? The strength of our projections alone are probably going to give us a lot more of an edge in that kind of contest, right? We don't need to fade ownership as much, right? I mean, a very easy way to think about this is like if you roster, the easiest way I like to think about of why maybe like ownership fade in general comes down for this particular situation is, if you roster a 10% owned player in this contest, there are only 9 other lineups, period, that you are competing with. 9 lineups, most likely on average, right? That also share that same player. You have 7 other spots in the lineup to differentiate from those 9 lineups, right? In a 10,000 person contest, right? A 10% owned player is going to be rostered by 100 other lineups, right? Oh God. I'm doing my tens tables. Every time I'm asked to do math here on the stream on the fly, I'm going to mess something up, but you get the idea, right? You're competing. You have to differentiate from a lot more lineups at larger fields, right? Same thing with your sim variants. A lot of times the reason why this comes up when you play higher and higher contests is 1, to differentiate your lineups more, but 2, because the strength of your average projections alone won't take you as far, right? You need to take more chances with players having outlier outcomes to beat out that number of pure more lineups in the contest. So no, these are the correct lineups in your particular contest. Again, for the question of didn't come close to the top 12, right? That's DFS. That's variance. You're going to lose more often than you win, right? I mean, keep in mind, this is a 100-person contest. Didn't come close to the top 12, right? Finishing in the top 12 is something that on average is probably only going to happen about once every 8 slates playing this contest, right? That's, I mean, assuming you have a little bit of an edge, maybe that's once every 7, every 6, but your expectation on any given night is still to lose. So that's variance. And a quick refresher on that, right? If anybody wants a refresher on the natural variance of DFS, the win expectations, how much you should expect to win, right? On our YouTube channel, all the way down here. What does variance after 100 slates look like for a winning player? There's actually an example at the end of this video where I kind of show in my 100 slate simulation what essentially you are doing if you are looking at one slate and trying to figure out why you lost. And I think it puts it into perspective of why there is very, very little that you can do after one losing slate in terms of analysis of what you could have done differently for that particular slate. And there's, in terms of what's actually useful, there's a ton you can do, but there's very little useful things you can do on one slate to determine what you could have done better. Now you can set habits of reviewing past slates and gain value from that over the course of a season or over the course of a month. But asking why maybe you failed in a particular contest last night, especially with one lineup, is an exercise in futility. It will give you very, very little meaningful feedback. So, okay. And then another question about leverage here. Okay, let's see. I have one more question. If I did a research build and a player is, for example, -15 leverage, but we deem that player a good play, should we fade that player? Or should we add that player? Can we turn him into a positive leverage by adding a little more exposure to that player? Okay, so I think there's kind of like a theoretical question here, and then I think there's like some practical confusion. So for the first question is, you've run a research build, right? So for those of you that don't know, what am I talking about when I say a research build? I don't even want to go to NBA because I don't do this that often for NBA. So let's go to golf because I think we have golf projections up. So a research build, right, is running a build with maximum sim variance 10, typically ownership fade and correlation off, with the goal of looking at how often a player shows up in the optimal lineup, right? This particular kind of build will basically show you, this will basically simulate the tournament out 1,500 times and show you the optimal lineup for 1,500 different simulations, right? And then you can use the exposures as a measure of how often a golfer shows up in the optimal lineup. So the question here is saying, if you did a research build and discovered, let's just do one, that a player has a -15% leverage, right? The field is going to roster that player at 15% more than the rate at which they show up in the optimal lineup. But you've determined that player to be a good play. What do you do? That's an interesting question. I would first kind of say, it's probably a good opportunity to go back and ask yourself, why do you think this player is a good play, right? Is there something in your projection that, or is there something that the projection that this player has isn't taking into account? Do you think the real actual ownership of this player is likely to be lower than we project? I would in general argue that something has to give, right? You actually almost can think about research builds as kind of an arbitrage, right? That you would get kind of in a market where one of these two numbers, right? Either there is a market inefficiency here, right? So either the field is inefficient on Victor Hovland, for example, or one of these two numbers has to be wrong, right? So, I mean, one way this could be wrong is that Hovland's projection is actually high and he actually doesn't finish in the optimal lineup 16% of the time. Or it could be that this projection is wrong and actually the field is going to roster him 15% of this over time. So if you were to tell me that you were going to do a research build and basically said, I actually want to play Will Zalatoris, for example, I think the first question would be to ask yourself, which of these two numbers is wrong? And figure out which one's wrong. From there, if you said, I actually think maybe it's a combination of both. I actually think he's going to be about a 15% owned, and I think this is a little bit low too. And you want to actually be on Will Zalatoris, for example, then yeah, I think it's perfectly fine to make sure that you, when you actually run your real build of lineups, to make sure that you have exposure to him. I think the one other thing I would remember here is like the results of your research build and the results of your actual build for your contests are not always going to be in line with one another, right? So for example, you can run a research build and come to the conclusion that it makes sense to be under the field on a particular player based on that. And SaberSim still gives you a pool of 20 lineups in your actual build where you are over the field on that particular player. And those are actually the players where the research build thing is kind of the most interesting, right? Like let's just go back here and look and see if we can find one, right? So okay, so we have Zalatoris, Adam Scott, Hovland, and Hideki, right? So let's go see if we can find one of those guys where the test build kind of gives us a different result here. Let's see. Okay, so, I mean, we're actually getting pretty good here. So in this case, it actually worked out pretty good. We are getting our test build here is kind of, I would say, generally in line. I guess actually, no, here's a good example, right? So our test build implied that we should fade Adam Scott, or our research build implied that we should fade Adam Scott, and our test build is saying that we should be double the field on him, right? These are the situations where it gets the most interesting, right? Because what's happening here is it's saying, yes, Adam Scott is slightly less likely to show up in the optimal lineup than his current projected ownership. But of the best 20 lineups you can play for a 20 max, he still appears in 8 of them, is essentially what the builder's telling you at this point. And this is where you kind of have decisions to make, right? You can make an adjustment here. You could leave it alone, right? This is kind of where the research build, I think, gets most interesting. So, but remember that, that research build at 0-10 is kind of a very specific thing that is used for a specific purpose to determine how likely a player is to show up in the optimal lineup. When you run your typical builds, right? Well, actually, let me back up and just say it this way. The leverage column here is always just exposure minus ownership, right? So it is important to kind of remember what this leverage column is giving to you based on the context of your build. In this case, we are just looking at 20 lineups built with default settings. Right. All this is saying, this is not saying that Matt Fitzpatrick in this case is a positive leverage build. Okay, let me actually. Brad asked a really good question. I think this is where sometimes there's confusion. He says, I don't think I'm understanding here, and I apologize. What is done different in a research build, a test build, and a final build? Okay. So when I say test build, right, and I probably should just define these somewhere because of how often I end up saying these. When I say a test build, I am typically saying go in, pick the sliders that you are going to use for your particular slate, right? For this particular slate, and just build the lineups and see what it looks like, right? That is a test build, right? It is default sliders. They are lineups that you could hypothetically enter into the contest. It is a good way to familiarize yourself with the slate before you've done any research, before you've made any adjustments. You just use it. Sometimes your test build might actually be your final build, right? They are just what you are kind of just seeing what the slate looks like. When I run what I call a research build, it is always a very specific build where I turn all of the sliders off except for sim variance 10, and I build 1,500 lineups. The goal of this build being, I want to see what 1,500 different single slate simulations look like, right? At sim variance 10 with other sliders at 0, You are basically going to say, use one simulation for every game on the slate, or in the case of golf, one simulation for the tournament, and build the optimal lineup for that particular sim. Then go to the next one. They go to the next one. You are essentially seeing 1,500 individual simulations of the slate. And the reason why I think this is useful is that you can ultimately see how often the player shows up, how often a player shows up in the optimal lineup, right? So let's actually name this here. This was our test build, right? And then this one was our, I think this one was our research build, right? You can see how often a player shows up in the optimal lineup in this set of simulations and compare it to their projected ownership as a way to determine how often a player shows up in the winning lineup for that contest. So this is essentially the research build, right? Leverage. So this is kind of what I was saying before I saw this question come in. Leverage always is just saying your current exposure in those lineups minus projected ownership. That is always what leverage is. But in this case, because we're looking at 1,500 slate simulations, this number gives us some strategic value, right? It is saying that Hovland in a 1,500 simulation pool of this week's event is optimal 7% more of the time than he is being rostered by the field. In this particular case, because of what we're looking at here, right? This isn't necessarily like a strategic suggestion here, because this is just 20 lineups out of a pool of 500 that we could even like hypothetically play. This is saying in your pool of lineups, you have 4.5% more Matt Fitzpatrick than the field. So Dempsey says, so do I change the setting from a 20 max to single entry when doing a research build of 1,500 lineups? It doesn't really matter what the drop downs say for your research build. It basically always looks like this. The other thing to note too here, I want to make this clear, is a research build is just something, it is a tool in your toolbox. It is a tool in my toolbox, right? It is a way of using basically the SaberSim builder to give you additional information about the slate. It is not a necessity by any means. I would say if you are completely lost with what I'm talking about here right now, avoid it completely. Don't let your process get more confusing in the name of trying to do these research builds, right? Once you have a clear understanding of the typical kind of SaberSim process, which is, I would say, running a test build, right? A test build, a build with default settings for your contest, seeing what the slate looks like, making a couple adjustments and entering those lineups, right? Once you are comfortable with that, then I think you can incorporate more research, period. For me, my favorite kind of research to do is with these research builds, because my favorite edge to push is typically ownership inefficiencies. For others, you may find that you're going out and, maybe doing some additional research elsewhere, or reading articles, or whatever you want to do, right? But first, make sure you have kind of a strong understanding of I would say the basics before incorporating these. And it's not necessarily the case that you need to do a research build to have success on every single slate with SaberSim. The last thing I want to do is confuse anybody and make this process seem more complicated than it really is. So I think that over time, especially for people that kind of watch this show every single day, you hear research build a lot. It becomes kind of a casual phrase that a lot of us use to talk about this very specific kind of build that I like to run and first introduced in some of our baseball content from last year. But it is not a necessity. It is not a necessary part of the process. It is purely, as it is named, a research tool to find maybe some ownership inefficiencies. So, okay, hopefully I helped make things clearer and not more confusing there. But if anybody has any follow-up questions about that, let me know. And I'm going to move on for now. But I am happy to answer more there if I did manage to confuse anybody. So, Brad, quickly here, I'll answer this one just because I saw it. Brad said, how effective do you think just running lines and plugging them in with no adjustments is? Extremely effective, especially on, I would say, on the top four, on our kind of our main four sports, NFL, NBA, and MLB. I think you can be extremely effective doing that, to be honest. There are a lot of slates for those three sports where that is actually exactly what I do. I think as you branch out from there, I think there's a spectrum of sports that you will benefit from additional adjustments on a sport-to-sport basis. I mean, I guess there's even exceptions with those individual sports. Like, I think there are really high value things you can do for each sport that will help a lot. Like, for example, in NBA, I am assuming that you mean that this also includes late swapping, right? Like, I think the proper way to play NBA would be to, do this, but then also late swap as news breaks throughout the slate, right? In MLB, I think you can still be extremely effective just building lineups with default settings. But I think because it's such a high variance sport, that for many people, there's additional value to be added by adjusting exposures, right? Maybe you're not comfortable being 90% exposed to a batter whose most common outcome is 0 points, right? That kind of thing. Other sports, I think there's a spectrum of value that can be added as well. I think in NHL, if you've seen our NHL video, I don't know where it is. Somewhere, there it is. How to beat NHL DFS in 2021. One of the things that Couch and Mr. Clean and I talked about a lot is one of the main ways you can add value is setting stacking rules, right? In that particular case, to help kind of give backstops to the correlation slider, right? So NASCAR, Brad actually mentioned NASCAR. I actually think NASCAR is one of the sports that we're probably most positioned to just plug and play the lineups that you get out of it, but it is so high variance because of these wrecks that you may find that you are better served adjusting your exposures down to drivers, right? Having 75, 80% of a particular driver leaves you exposed to a lot of, to a potentially very negative week or a race if your driver wrecks. So, but yes, I think in general, right, the goal here is that you have a pool of very viable lineups at your disposal without making any adjustments at all. So Dempsey said, thanks for clearing that up, was getting sim variance of 10 and single entry confused. Yeah. So, if you were building a single entry lineup, right, like this would be a lineup, maybe you're playing a single entry contest and you're building your lineups, right? The research build is simply a research tool. I wouldn't ever necessarily, I generally wouldn't enter lineups from a research build. It's just a way of visualizing sim data, essentially. So, and I'm glad that managed to clear things up again, because the last thing, my goal with the research build is to, give people a tool to do research. The last thing that needs to happen there is leave anybody more confused. So anyway, let's keep it going here. And jump into some other questions. There was one other question from GEN about ownership sum. I covered that at the start of the stream, so I'm going to leave that one alone here now and move on to the next question. Interesting one from Leland here. He says, what stats correlate to fantasy production in NBA? I think the least interesting and the shortest answer to this particular question involves just looking up the scoring rules for each site, right? Obviously, any fantasy, any basketball stat that results in fantasy point scoring is going to have essentially a 1-to-1 correlation, right? Points scored is going to have a 1-to-1 correlation with fantasy points scored because there are fantasy points awarded for basketball points, right? From there, I mean, I think, stats that lead to those other stats happening, right, are obviously correlated there. Shot attempts have a very strong correlation to fantasy point production. Rates have a very strong assist rates in general would correlate highly to fantasy point production. I think what the point of this question, or I think like the spirit of what's being asked here, is probably more of like, where can you go to do research? What stats are things that you could research to add value to the process? And actually, that's not, from my perspective, the highest value add on the NBA side. Our NBA model is very, very good. In our backtesting, I actually think we have a very compelling case to be made that we have the best overall NBA projections in the industry. I don't think that you are going to find that there is, some rogue stat out there that could be researched and value added to the model. I will give you kind of two paths for ways to add value to SaberSim for your NBA lineups. The first is that there are situations in any sport that are inherently difficult to project, right? If a key player is injured, and maybe that player has not been injured much this season and has not missed many games, or if a player is new to a team, there was a trade that has recently happened. What's another example? Maybe a new rotation, right? The coach is using a new rotation. Those situations are inherently going to be less projectable because there's less data to back them up, right? For example, as the trade deadline gets kind of further and further in the rear mirror, it becomes easier to project these teams. But I would say that the Nets right now at the moment are somewhat a more difficult team to project, right? Because their team construction has changed pretty dramatically in the past month. Even though we have some more data about this new version of this Nets team, it's not, what we can't use as much information from the past. So the first kind of path is to, instead of looking for a stat that the model isn't taking into account or is particularly correlative or predictive of upside, look for situations that are inherently hard to project by definition, because there's less historical backing, right? I think that's a sharp idea. Or in particular, look for situations where the field is assuming something is a sure thing, right? I think you can be somewhat justified in being a little bit, I think you can be justified in being skeptical of highly owned players, chalky players in game situations where it's difficult to project the game situation, right? Like, for example, if a key player is ruled out for a team, right, it is going to open up value on that particular team. If there is a big discrepancy in the value, in the ownership projections of the value that opens up, that can sometimes be a situation to exploit, or at least research more, right? Van Vliet going out, right, is going to open up a ton of value for the Raptors, just like it did last night. If one particular player is capturing all of that ownership, it can sometimes be a good situation to look a little bit closer, right? Flynn had a good night last night at basically min price. It was very easy for him to reach value. And I don't think, at least in my research, it seemed like he was going to be over the top owned. I think partly because that news broke so late. But if it was a situation where Flynn was going to be 60% owned, right, it might have been an opportunity maybe to have gotten more exposure to other owned plays. Scotty Barnes was, I don't think, egregiously high owned last night. I don't think he was an extremely high owned play, right? And he is a player where there's naturally going to be some usage that opens up when a guy like Van Vliet goes out. Those are kind of the situations where I think there can be an opportunity. That's not researching necessarily so much, but almost more of picking your spots on situations that are difficult to project. So Brad says 76ers as well. Yeah, same kind of idea. Just situations where there is not as much data to back up the projection. So, all right, cool. James asks a question about exposure here and says, hi, Jordan. When doing 20 max entries for large field GPPs and small GPPs, do you think it's a good idea to change the player's max exposure to the field for my highest exposure players? I really don't touch my uniques, but I leave it at 1. But do you think I should change my uniques for 20 max entries? Okay, let me look at this first question here. Do you think it's a good idea to change the player's max exposure to the field for my highest exposure players? I think it is an interesting idea. It will probably... I think what you are going to end up doing is you are going to find that you are spreading out your exposure pretty significantly. And what you are doing really is you are probably sacrificing an overall ownership edge. In NBA, I don't know if I would like this as much because in NBA, there are big ownership inefficiencies, right? Like the field is not going to roster players at their appropriate ownership for particular contests, especially at lower stakes, right? The field is going to miss. They are not going to know efficiently what the best projected plays on the slate are. So if you go in here and say, for example, right, that you want 25% Daniel Gafford, you are potentially sacrificing an opportunity to get an edge there by rostering more. You are rostering closer to what his actual efficient ownership is. There are sports, however, where the ownership edge, I don't think, is the biggest edge that you can find, right? I actually think NASCAR is a good example of that. The field is going to be so inefficient in NASCAR with their lineup construction, right? The field is going to very easily build lineups that are just poorly constructed, that don't have a very high chance of together having an upside condition, that you don't really need to worry as much about ownership inefficiencies on particular drivers. So in fact, when I'm building my NASCAR lineups, one thing that I am doing sounds very similar to this strategy is when I'm building these lineups, I'm going in and capping my exposure on some of my highest owned drivers to their projected ownership. Because one, I want to lower my variance in a high variance sport, but two, I am more interested in building lineups that together are constructed in a way that gives them upside because they're coming from single race simulations. I am less concerned about saying that I am over the field on an inefficiently owned driver. I don't think either way, I don't think this is going to hurt you if you do this. I think ultimately the impact is you're going to have a more diversified pool of lineups, right? You're probably going to have a lot more spread out results. You'll have probably more lineups at the top and more lineups at the bottom. And I think in effect, you are kind of playing an angle of, I guess you are prioritizing the lineup construction in that case rather than the ownership. And I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of giving mixed signals here a little bit with this particular question. I don't think there's anything wrong with diversifying, lowering your volatility, bringing down your risk on any particular player on the slate, but matching your top exposed players in your pool of lineups for NBA on every single lineup, I think is sacrificing a pretty good edge, right? Like last night, I don't know if I would have wanted to have been under on Brandon, or I don't know if I would have wanted to match the field on Brandon Goodwin and Trey Lyles and I don't know, some of these other well-projected plays last night because the field simply didn't roster them enough. So short answer, final answer, capping your maximum exposure to match your risk tolerance is a good thing. Blindly matching the field on every player in the pool or on your top exposed players for NBA, I would probably say is not a good thing. And then uniques, I'll quickly answer this one. I don't touch uniques very often. I think it's a kind of a blunt tool to force more diversity into your lineups. And I think sim variance is a better way of doing that. So if you build your lineups, again, start with a test build. If you build your test build and you say, wow, these lineups look very similar, or I am extremely concentrated on just a couple plays on this particular slate, and I don't like that, I would instead go back to step one or step two and increase your sim variance before I touched my min uniques. Because the sim variance is going to increase your diversity of your lineups in a more natural way by looking at a smaller set of simulations for each lineup. Min uniques is purely it's a blunt tool that is going to affect the lineup construction by forcing unique players into lineups. So, okay, I see a couple other questions in Slack. I want to get to the questions in YouTube chat first because I know the YouTube chat's been waiting for a minute here. So let me go ahead and clear this out. Brad had asked a question earlier. Is there a bug with the app with having to run single entry contests or user error can never get it to run on a single entry? It's a DraftKings regulation, actually. So basically, DraftKings wants to avoid a situation where you can just go in and build like an optimal or the optimal for a particular slate. So I don't see it right now. It seems like it's actually going to let me do that. It's probably because I've changed something here. Something is not default. But if you go into a brand new slate and don't touch a thing and then try to just build one lineup, it's going to tell you you need to make adjustments on step 1, right? It's basically the same message you see on step 3 sometimes. You need to make at least 2 adjustments. Those are all just DraftKings compliance things. I think the easiest way is to just build more than one, build like 10, even if you're just playing a single entry. Make 2 adjustments to exposures or projections or something on step 3, and then you can adjust your number of lineups back down to 1 in step 3. That, I think, is the easiest way to do it. So, and then Brad, there was another question here. I also hear the mention of test builds on showdowns. If I run lines 10 minutes before lock and then again 5 minutes before lock, as long as no surprise players are out, would you expect the lines to be the same? No, actually. Some of them would, but not all of them. If we go, the main reason why is because you're going to have a different set of simulations that are selected, right, for each build. On showdowns, typically sim variance is going to be very high, right? So, for a contest like this, for example, right, our sim variance is 10. Every single lineup is going to be built from a single game simulation. We are building 500, and we are ultimately selecting 20. We've simulated this game thousands of times. So there is a selection bias here always, where if you run this build over and over and over and over again, even with the exact same projections, you are not always going to get the exact same set of 20, which is ultimately a good thing, right? Any optimizer that builds you the exact same set of lineups every single time you press build is inflating the expected value of those lineups. It is implying that those lineups have are much more optimal or much more profitable than they actually are, right? So because of the fact that we're pulling directly from the simulation data with single game simulations, where your lineups will not be identical if you run them over and over again up against lock. Now, on the practical side, I think you are generally good to run your NBA showdown lineups once both teams have confirmed starting lineups. That's when I run mine, right? So, Tom says, in tiers, is it true to pick the guy with more minutes and a higher condition? I would say for NBA in tiers, the optimal strategy is probably just to always pick the guy with the higher overall projection and late swap if you can. Again, I don't know if you can actually late swap in tiers. I haven't been playing it. And I know the last time there was a tiers question, I didn't know, but assuming that you can, I think NBA tiers strategy is for NBA is probably limited to just picking the highest projected player, and then late swapping when possible. I think there's maybe a little bit of an argument to be made. I don't know how inefficient ownership gets in tiers, so there might be an argument to be made that if say the top tier is these 5 guys, right? If Luka is going to be 60% owned or something like that in tiers, then maybe it makes sense to play somebody else. But I don't think it makes up a 12-point projection gap in that case. So in higher correlation sports like NFL, I think tiers gets more interesting because then there's an argument to be made about correlating the quarterback and the receiver and things like that. But for NBA, I would probably just pick the highest projected guys and stay updated throughout the night. So, and then another question in round 4 showdown golf. I find lower owned guys is the way to go. Most winners have lower owned guys in round 4 showdown. They're not even picking the leaders. Yeah. I mean, I think golf showdown's tough. I think it's beatable because of how inefficient ownership gets. I think you honestly probably could get an edge in showdown golf just paying attention to who outperformed expectation the day before and just making sure you are underweight on those golfers the next day, right? After round 1, in round 2, every golfer that was successful in round 1 is almost always, the field is almost always overweight to those guys relative to their actual average expectation, right? So I think playing an ownership game and particularly looking at just literally what happened the day prior is a pretty good way to be successful in golf. I do think it's in golf showdown. I do think it's very, very hard. And I think there's a very small, a very thin edge in golf showdown. But there's a part of me that thinks there might be a bigger ownership inefficiency edge in Golf Showdown than there is in Golf main slates, because you don't get the same kind of, somebody might disagree with me there. But I think that the field is more efficient on their ownership for main slates than they are for the showdowns at times. There's way more variance in showdown, but I think the ownership inefficiency is bigger. So I think it's an interesting idea of an edge to push there, of just being very aggressive with your stands on golfers that outperformed expectation the day prior. So, because people just underrate the potential of a player having a very different outcome than they did the day before, right? Like, I mean, what was Berger's ownership in round 4? Like 50%, right? For a single round of golf, there's no golfer that should be 50% owned, even for round 4, even for a guy that's 5 shots ahead. It just shouldn't happen. So, but okay, cool. Getting caught up here. All right. We're caught up on YouTube chat. Let's jump back to Slack. There are 2 other questions here. We'll hit these 2 questions, and then we got to wrap up for today. So we'll hit these ones quickly. We'll be right back again tomorrow. But we have a question from Stanley here. And says, with SaberSim putting an emphasis on correlation when building lineups, do you not need rules like pair QB with 2 pass catchers from the same team? Additionally, with NBA, would I not need rules to prevent the starting center and backup center in the same lineup for larger slates, obviously? Yes, in general, this is true. The goal of SaberSim, or one of the many goals here, is that you do not need to go in and set all these complicated groups and rules and things like that for every player and team on the slate, because since we are simulating these games, we have a sense of what players are correlated and by how much, etc. Right? With NFL, you will see that this is very much the case, right? If you go in, we don't obviously have live NFL going on, but you could go into a past slate, for example, and just play with it. All the projections are still there, and just build lineups with default settings, no stacking rules, no player groups, and you are going to see that in general, that the lineups you get are kind of automatically stacked with the right kind of lineup constructions you would want. You may see that there are lineups that you get that have a quarterback and, okay, so I guess this one's missing the projections. I believe most of the weeks should have projections, but you may see occasionally that there are slates or there are lineups that have a quarterback with no pass catcher, right? Those are more often than not running quarterbacks that have the potential to be optimal without a pass catcher. You may see situations where you have 2 players from the same team without the quarterback, right? Those are typically going to be situations. Okay, so it seems like we're missing NFL projections here. So maybe I'll see what's going on there. But anyway, if you get 2 players from the same team, no quarterback, it's probably from a game with a very high scoring environment or something like that, right? So that is kind of the general goal. In NBA, that goal is also true. The idea is that you can build lineups leveraging the simulations and correlations, and you will get lineups that have a high chance of being successful together. NBA correlations are much lower than people think. The most negative correlations you are likely going to see in general are for, I would say, probably bigs that basically do the exact same thing on the court. But these negative correlations often don't get much bigger than I would say about this, negative 0.14. And also, based on our back testing, the actual value of correlation as a factor in your lineup constructions does not need to be very high to build high upside lineups. The main reason why is that, even for 2 negatively correlated players, right? If there is a salary inefficiency, right? If you take out a starter from a team, the rising tide lifts all boats in that particular situation, right? Even negatively correlated players are all going to become efficient plays for their salaries. And you can often find that, I think, when you are building lineups with SaberSim here for NBA, you may run into a situation where 2 very well projected players that occupy a similar role in the court may show up in a lineup together, right? Because of the salary inefficiency. You might get a Gafford and Hachimura lineup together, right? If you are, okay, so in this case, these 2, Okay, so in this case, these two players don't even seem to be too negatively correlated. If you are, right, one thing you can do, and you want to avoid that, is you can set a group here to group those two players together, right? So one group that I think I could see people potentially making here is something like this. So grouping these Washington centers together and saying less than or equal to 1, right? And I think this would be a fine group to make. But if you get a lineup that has two of these two players in it together, it is important to remember that it is not pure luck. It is not just because those players fit in because of their average projections, right? There is a set of simulations that backs up those two players appearing in the lineup together, that at least based in our simulations, those two players can be in the winning lineup together. So again, short answer here is that yes, the way that, because we are leveraging simulations to build your lineups and not just optimizing for average projection, and we are also using a correlative factor that is appropriate for the sport and contest that you are playing, your lineups right out of the box without setting a single rule are going to be built with constructions that have upside. I guess kind of the one other point to that is that if you are getting combinations of players that you don't want, or want to emphasize certain combinations of players beyond that, I would do that with a stacking rule or a grouping rule. So, all right, cool. And then last question here. This is from Reed. And he said, is there a way to export your player pool and lineups? Not really the pool, but the players that are included in your lineups. Specifically looking to be able to sort on a spreadsheet that would include leverage for hockey. There's not like a very easy way to do this, I would say. Or there's not just like a press the button and get the export. We have talked about adding something like this where you could not only, right now you can obviously download your lineups, but there's not really any way to just export exposures or leverage or anything like that. So short answer is no. I would say you can. You can somewhat easily kind of rebuild any of the information that you see here using a combination of your lineups, right? Your lineups download and the projections download on step 1, right? In Excel or something like that. So basically, like kind of what you want to do is you would download your lineups and use count if functions in Excel and count. For example, if you wanted to calculate your exposures in Excel again, you could count if the DFS player IDs for your set of lineups and then divide by the number of lineups. So again, not an easy way to do it. We want to add an easier way to do it. But if you are kind of interested in going down that path, you can build an Excel spreadsheet that will do that for you. So, yeah. But cool. All right. I'm going to leave it there for today. Thank you to everybody that tuned in, asked questions, participated. Big thank you to everybody that watches this show and listens to the show after it goes up on our YouTube channel as well. My apologies to anybody that was left a little bit confused through the middle segment here when we were talking about the test and research builds. I hope I managed to clear that up for everybody. If there are any follow-up questions, always feel free to reach out, because the last thing I want to do is leave anybody confused here after watching one of these streams. So we will be right back again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. So good luck in your contest tonight. I will see you guys all tomorrow. Until then, take care. See ya.